Hello everybody, this is Jason Heires. This is going to be my album review, Volume 2. And today I'm going to talk about an album that I'm probably going to get pulled off in a lot of different directions on. The album is Nevermind the Bollocks, and the band is the Sex Pistols. Now, this album was recorded and released in 1977, and it is a groundbreaking punk rock album. And just really quickly about the music itself, because there's a lot of things that I'm going to talk about that really don't have a lot to do with the actual music. But the music is really good. The lyrics are really interesting. There's a lot of really valid social criticism on this album. And in terms of just being an album by itself, it is a classic album. It's the only Sex Pistols album, and there's a lot of good reasons why that ended up happening that way. But, you know, it was a good combination of people. Now, the Sex Pistols were the band, the Sex Pistols. The original Sex Pistols were Johnny Rotten or John Lydon. We got Glenn Matlock, who was the original bass player and helped write many of the songs. You have Steve Jones, who was the guitar player. And then you have Paul Cook, who played drums. Now, before this album was released, Glenn Matlock left the band and he was replaced by Sid Vicious. Now, we'll talk more about Sid Vicious in a little bit, but the truth is Sid Vicious couldn't play a lick, and he wasn't picked because he was a real musician. He was picked because he had the quote-unquote punk look and he could be an ally for Johnny Rotten, and that was it. But fortunately, when they recorded the album, what ended up happening was Sid was sick, something was wrong with him, I can't remember the specifics. But anyway, actually the bass was all played on this album was played by Steve Jones as well. So all the bass and all the guitars were all played by Steve Jones. Now, Steve Jones plays very simple, muscular guitar, and he really, has a really good, straightforward kind of punch in the jaw kind of sound. Then you got Johnny Rotten, who is really scathing with his social criticism and doesn't really care about who he pisses off. He sings almost off-key at times, but it works for the way he does it. You know, little subtle word plays like changing pretty vacant into vacant, for instance. I mean, there's just a lot of things with this album that make it a great punk rock album. It is a seminal work. But the problem is all the other stuff that went on with the Sex Pistols. And a lot of it has to do with their manager, a man by the name of Malcolm McLaren. Now, Malcolm McLaren was in New York, and he was there in the early punk scene and saw some of the people. And he kind of took back some of the fashion that he saw there and started selling it. And basically, he became the manager of the Sex Pistols, and a lot of what he was just doing was trying to find ways for them to be controversial in order to help them sell. So, the Sex Pistols did a lot of really outrageous things, They went on a national news broadcast and cussed out the announcer. They played on a barge and followed the Queen's Jubilee Parade and played God Save the Queen, which is not a flattering song for the Queen at all. They did a lot of things, and they really ended up generating a lot of bad press, I guess we'll say. And, it just was a really, and it created a lot of problems. They sent the Sex Pistols to the U.S. for a tour, but they put them in cities that were going to cause controversy. A lot of southern cities like Texas and Oklahoma, and places that just aren't a place that would appreciate a band like the Sex Pistols, especially when we're talking about the late 1970s. These are more conservative places. Finally, they play their final show in San Francisco, and Johnny Rotten famously says, do you get the feeling you've been cheated, and kneels down, and that's his last gig, and that was the end of the Sex Pistols. Now, they've had reunions and things like that since then, But the truth is that the band was a mess in terms of, because they got so caught up in this big, like, having to be so crazy and sensational crap that, the music kind of took a second seat to that. The other thing is we need to talk about Sid Vicious. Now, I don't understand the Sid Vicious mentality, or some people really have this weird thing where they kind of look up to Sid Vicious and his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen, and God knows why, because those people were horrible people, and they were awful. I mean, there's a part in a movie called, a documentary called D.O.A., and it's a good documentary to see that's not just about the Sex Pistols. There's a lot of other really cool UK punk bands like the X-Ray Specs and a couple other bands. That really makes it interesting. And Sham 69 and some other really good bands. But the thing is that Sid and Nancy were terrible people, and when they're in the bed together and they're all screwed up on heroin or whatever it was they're in there, and he's burning her with cigarette ashes, and they're just totally confused and anything. Why anybody would think that was something to aspire to just boggles the mind. I mean, that's the total opposite of what anybody should ever want to aspire to. Sid Vicious was a lost, confused person who had serious problems, and that's nothing for anybody to ever look up to, ever. Now, the other thing about this, though, is we got to talk a little bit about, so all this sensationalism about Sid Vicious, everything, the band broke up. The other thing that really happened with this was, with all the controversy that the Sex Pistols caused and kind of the disaster of their tour in America and everything, is it really closed doors for a lot of these punk bands that were good bands to come to America. And a lot of these bands never did. I mean, these are bands that were really good bands that were like The Damned, like Sham 69, like the X-Ray Specs, like The Jam. The Clash eventually did come to America. They were the only one that actually really came to America. They opened for The Who on one of their last tours, and it was shortly after that the Clash really broke it big, because the truth is America is so much more of a big market and there's so much more money there that in order for a lot of these bands to really take off and have a real impact, they really should have went to America, but they didn't. A lot of them were denied entry. There's a song by Sham 69 where Sham 69 was denied entry into the United States because somebody had a pot possession charge in the UK. And the song goes, "They didn't want to go, they didn't want us in the USA, we didn't want to go there anyway, didn't want us in the US of A. I don't know, boss, have another puff on the grass." And, and it's a direct protest on how stupid it is that they weren't allowed in there because one of their guys happened to have a little pot. So it really closed, the Sex Pistols' outrageous behavior really made it so that the punk scene in the UK stayed in the UK, and it never really came to the United States because the United States and the powers that be were like, no, we don't want to bring this shit into our country, so we're just going to stop it. And, so in a lot of ways, the Sex Pistols gave a lot to punk rock, but they also did almost as much to destroy punk rock at the same time. And that's why, even though this is definitely a classic album, and is definitely one of the signature punk rock albums of all time, you have to have at least a little bit of ambivalence about the Sex Pistols because of the damage they did. And it was primarily because of the encouragement of Malcolm McLaren. And I just want to make that abundantly clear. Anyway, like I said, I was going to veer off topic a little bit. Musically, lyrically, it's a really great album, and it definitely is worth paying attention to. There's all kinds of different things that talk about the Sex Pistols' brief history and documentary. But the one that really is the most interesting, once again, is D.O.A. It's a little hard to find, but if you can find it, it's definitely worth checking out. Anyway, that's it for now. Thank you for listening. Have a good day, guys.